ask one more question about Yeltsin's period, but it's important. Russia was not invited to WTO until very late. It was knocking on the door for decades, and only in late Putin's years it finally happened. And in the beginning, we don't know if Putin was pretending, but he was talking to Bill Clinton, to Lord George Robertson, General Secretary of NATO. He was proposing, asking for the invitation to NATO. He sounded as he was in favor of Russia joining NATO. Was it an option? Was it a missed possibility, or you don't believe it?
First, on the WTO piece, I think one of the things that loans for shares taught all of us in the international system and the ruble crash of '98 was that it was going to take quite a bit of time for Russia to implement the kind of economic safety net and undercarriage to be a country that could live up to its WTO obligations. And there always are a lot of concrete hoops to go through before you can get into the WTO, and it took Putin quite a while to get there. I mean, just floating the currency was a requirement, as you know, and the Chinese did that faster than Russia, et cetera. So I would argue that what happened there was that we were a little bit burned by what happened in the late 90s and wanted to make sure that all of the standards of the organization were met. With regard to NATO, my memory of this, I remember several conversations with Yeltsin in his second term about whether Russia should get on a path to joining NATO, because, as you know, all of the neighbors by that time were either in NATO or on the way. And our attitude was, if you're prepared to be that kind of country, a solid democracy with real elections, real free press, real openness, real transparent budgets, real opportunity for free trade, why not? It will be a different Russia, but it would also create a cementing of the relationship between Europe and Russia. And in fact, that's why we initially created in '97 the Permanent Joint Council between Russia and NATO, and then later in the Bush administration where we created the NATO-Russia Council. And I really thought in those days that well before Russia was fully admitted, if she wanted to be, that most of the business of NATO would move to the NATO-Russia Council. Because there were a lot of things that we could have been doing together, for example, missile defense vis-a-vis Iran, et cetera. But I think it was Putin's ultimate suspicion. He thought Russia was too big to be in this family. He didn't want to be constrained. He didn't want truly to meet the democratic standards, as we know, because he was taking Russia in the wrong direction. I don't remember a conversation with Putin and our leaders about joining NATO. I think he thought he had a different concept of Russia, that it was, he didn't want to be like Germany. He wanted to be a counterweight to NATO, and that's what we see.
And going slightly to the beginning of the 90s and the process of the enlargement of NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is a mythical agreement between James Baker and Foreign Minister Shevardnadze. And a lot of Russian authors write about it, that yes, there was nothing signed on paper, but verbally there was a mutual agreement that after the collapse of after the end of the Soviet Union, NATO doesn't go further to the east. And according to that mythical idea, which is very popular in Russia, that promise was broken by the Clinton administration. Was there any kind of dilemma in Clinton era to go east, to enlarge NATO or not?
First of all, I would note that Baker, who supposedly made this deal, categorically denies that he ever said it, as does George H.W. Bush. He says that it never happened and that there was never such a conversation. So that's a question mark. Look, I mean, I think the problem is, and it's a particular problem as Putin and Putinism have deepened and lasted so long, is this enemy image of NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance. It doesn't attack you unless you attack it first. So the idea of the Permanent Joint Council between Russia and NATO, and then the NATO-Russia Council, was that if we are not enemies, if we are not attacking each other, we can use these structures to advance our shared security interests together. And that was the goal. And so as NATO gets bigger, it's not getting bigger to attack Russia, it's getting bigger to ensure that if there is a reversal in Russia, which we now see, that those countries are protected, but also that we as a democratic family can act together in other parts of the world, as we later did in Afghanistan, as we later did in training in Iraq, because we understand each other. Had Russia been willing to be that kind of partner, had Russia been interested in being a NATO member, I think history would have been different. But it would have had to have maintained and strengthened and deepened the original idea of a democratic system. It would have had to have gone in the direction that Poland and Lithuania and Latvia went, of real elections and real political parties and real free and open press, and the security services being in their box, and judiciaries providing humans a real chance, and